It's Sunday, February 12th, 2017, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we're joined by one of our mentors, Chris Butler, Senior Product Strategist at Philosophy, and he's going to lead a talk on strategy in an agile environment. So those of you who are joining us, perhaps for the first time today, allow me to briefly explain the format. The Product Mentor Program is a program designed to pair up mentors and mentees all around the world in the field of product management to help make better product people, better product decisions, and hopefully better products in the due course. So the people you see along the bottom of your screen right here are mentors and mentees within the current program, this current session of the Product Mentor. We run 2 sessions a year, one at the top half and the bottom half of every year. What we'll do first is just go around the room, do some quick introductions, their name, a little bit about themselves, and whether or not they're a mentor or mentee in the program. And then I'll come back, tell you a little bit about myself and how you can participate in today's live stream. So I'll start with whoever is closest to me, and that person is Paul.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Hurwitz, Director of Active Analytics/Product at Active Health Management, subsidiary of Aetna. I've been in product management for a little bit more than 10 years, and I am one of the mentors.
And let's go to Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Jones. I'm product manager at Broadband TV, working with YouTubers. I've been a product manager for about 4 years now. I'm a mentee in the program.
Great. And Kenan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenan Murphy-Sierra. I work on the product team at On Deck, and I'm a mentee in the Product Mentor program, and I've been working in a product capacity for about a year now.
Chris.
Yep, I'm Chris Butler, Senior Product Strategist at Philosophy. I've been a product manager on and off for almost 16 years, dabbling in business development. And yeah, I'm a mentor. This is my second mentorship within the Product Mentor group.
Excellent. And I am Jeremy Horn, aka the Product Guy, and I'll be moderating here today. And so if you join us on the productmentor.com/live, on the top of the page, within the tabs, you will see the live stream. Hopefully that you're seeing us there right now. Along the bottom of that page, you will see the ability to submit your questions, the questions that are topically related. I will pass along in somewhat real time over to our mentor today, Chris. For those that are maybe more generic, like what is product management? What does it mean to be a product manager? Why am I here? All those kinds of more abstract or broader questions, I'll save for the end of the talk. But feel free to add those as well, ask those as well. With all that said, what we'll do now is let me hand it over to Chris to take it away with his talk on strategy in an agile environment.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's great to be able to give this talk. Yeah, so strategy in an agile environment. As I said, I'm a product manager of almost, 16 years now. I participated in both the season 4 and this season 6 for the Product Mentor. I was very honored to be named the best product person of 2016 as well. Some of the companies I've worked for in the past in both a product manager or business development capacity, Microsoft, Waze, Horizon Ventures, and Kayak. I also even started my own company, which failed, unfortunately, but learned an awful lot about that. So I work for Philosophy. We do product and design discovery, and that's for both large and small companies. We like to say that we help organizations with their strategy through shipping. So we have offices in LA, New York, and San Francisco. I work out of the New York City office. And we think a lot about Agile and Lean, and in particular, we run with what's called a balanced team approach. So that means a engineer, designer, and product, what we call a product strategist, works together in tandem. And so, a lot of the reason why I'm giving this talk today is one, I've learned a lot through my career from other people about strategy, about product management. And so this is kind of my way to give back a synthesized version of what I've learned so far. But then also to really do a good job understanding something is you need to teach it to someone else. And so what we're going to go through today is we're going to go through first a cautionary tale. about strategy. We're going to talk about what about Agile actually works, or how why does it work. We'll talk about strategy. Why does Agile need strategy? How to create a good strategy, and then how do you test that strategy, and then how does that link to your day-to-day, which is really the most important thing when it comes to product management. So the cautionary tale is what I'll call the quality sprint. And so generally, whenever we'll take on a client, we'll run somewhere between, we could do a week or two discovery sprint, which would really be figuring out what to build and why, identifying problems, that type of thing. But we'll also take on longer engagements, which will be 8 to 12 weeks. One of the more recent ones, I think we were in week 7 of the engagement. We had built a bunch of different things, and we wanted to clean it up, or really kind of like polish the product to get ready for a pilot. And so that was where this particular quality sprint came up, to really, I guess, tighten things up, make sure that they were working correctly, but not only that, did it look good? Were there hard edges that we could smooth out? And so the problem here, though, is that what is quality, or what is polish, or what meets this bar is very different depending on what you actually need to do, or what your end goal is of that particular project. And so this was maybe an identifying point that we didn't have a very good overall strategy. We didn't have that kind of like North Star, right? And so this got us thinking an awful lot about how do we do a better job of clearly defining what the overall reason for doing this project is. And I think if we had documented this earlier on, this type of finishing up or tying up loose ends in a project would have been much simpler. So first, I assume most people are familiar with Agile. Really the point of Agile is to figure things out iteratively with small and highly collaborative teams, of course, that work directly with the customer. And so we assume through Agile that we don't know as much right now as we will in the future. And so because of that, we're constantly learning from our customer by not only talking to them, but also building for them and trying things out with them. And I think, when looking back at how waterfall methodologies would work, especially when I was at Microsoft and kind of at the end of my time doing an engineering degree, waterfall was kind of the way to do things. And when I was at Microsoft, no matter how much I thought about all the edge cases or tried to write as long of a spec as possible, or PRD, to get everything down on paper, it didn't really matter because there were always things that I just couldn't think of. And so, after going through that for many years and then starting to work in true Agile teams, it makes a lot more sense to me. It means that we're a lot more productive and we're able to, push a lot faster towards something rather than deciding what we're going to do at the very beginning and not changing at all. And I think something else to note here is how Agile teams work as well. So not just the fact that Agile is a way to build software, I think not only faster, but people enjoy doing it more. They find more meaning in the work that they're doing because of the autonomy, but also that they get to a better result. And so I think how Agile teams work in different types of organizations is very important too. So when waterfall made a lot of sense, we were thinking much more in a bureaucratic or command and control type of way. So there was someone at the top, they had an idea, they wanted to make it real, they broke that idea up to multiple people, and then each of those teams executed on their piece. There wasn't a lot around innovation. If there was innovation that was coming from the individual teams, it had to be pushed back up the management hierarchy. Within the Agile team, which is the top right of this slide, everybody's working very tightly together. There's a really great iterative loop that's happening. I think, part of this graph that is missing is kind of that customer thing. But when you think about it in context, when you talk about Agile teams now in a bureaucracy, you really still have this command and control. There still is this issue of some type of top entity dictating down to Agile teams to develop things. And I think part of this issue is how do they actually transmit that information? And so a lot of the time we would call that vision or mission or strategy. Once we start to work in a true Agile network, though, there's no longer this bureaucratic top-down type of thinking, but how is it that all of these different groups work together in a very highly iterative fashion And in particular, how do the managers form their own Agile team, which is thinking about hiring, culture, and strategy, and then how do they work with all of the different Agile teams that are actually doing execution, and how do the customers actually fit into all of this? And so that's where I think when you start to think about how Agile, if you start to break everybody into Agile teams within the organization, you need to have a way to write down strategy, right? You need to have a way to really talk about what the company is supposed to do, or the organization. And so, this is when we get to the question of what is strategy. I think there's a lot of terms out there, like, again, mission, vision, even goals can be conflated sometimes with strategy, but I really like the word strategy rather than mission or vision, because it feels a little bit more practical. And I think there's some really great definitions that are out there. So in particular, this came from a particular definition that came out of an Evergreen post on strategy. And so in this particular case, I think it lays out a pretty robust way to think about strategy. So again, a handful of decisions that drive most of the subsequent decisions and actions of a business. They're not necessarily easily changed. So you don't want to be changing your strategy every week like you would, say, doing a sprint every week. They have the greatest impact on whether an objective will be achieved, which is that objective of the organization. It combines not only your assets and capabilities, but how you take those and then deliver the value to customers. And it creates some type of advantage within the competitive environment. And that's very interesting. I think in some cases, people think too much about competitive landscape when it comes to strategy, but it's a very important piece of understanding your strategy. And then in the end, it should really lead to some type of superior growth or profitability. You should not be taking on a strategy that makes your business fail, or at least you shouldn't, you shouldn't be doing that purposely. I think John Boyd, who was a famous military strategist in the U.S. Air Force and then helped with doctrine for the Marines and just in general military strategy for the U.S., he was the person who came up with the OODA loop, which is really the great granddaddy of Agile thinking. And his definition really of strategy, the goal of a strategy is to survive and survive on our own terms or improve our capacity for independent action. So a lot of the time when we talk about startups pivoting an awful lot, it really is just to pivot to survive, right? In a lot of cases, especially when you're a small company, that's really all you're trying to do most of the time. Even when you're a large company, if you are a large company that has already won a market, you really only have the only place you have to go is down when it comes to that one market, or you have to now succeed or survive in other markets with regards to a strategy. So I think this is a very good definition of that. So when we start to talk about what is good strategy, we also want to start with what is bad strategy. And so what I would say is, sorry about that. What I would say is, let's see here. All right. So this is a really great book. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy is a book by Richard Rummelt, who is a strategy consultant. I think he's worked with the military a little bit, but also does business strategy. And this is a great book. I can't recommend it enough. But he really tries to focus in on what is bad strategy. And when we talk about bad strategy, I think he really identifies 4 things that I think are very key to remember when talking about strategy. So one of the things that a bad strategy will do is failure to face the challenge. So that means that it's not looking to actually solve anything that's very meaningful. And we'll talk about what the definition of a challenge is in a little bit, but I think that's probably the biggest issue that I've seen. Mistaking goals for strategy is another one that can be very common, where saying that you want to grow 20% year over year, that's not a strategy. That's just a goal that you have. There's a strategy that will help you get there, but that's just a goal. And then bad strategic objectives, which this tends to happen with larger organizations where each individual group wants to get their own thing done. And so it ends up, rather than making hard choices, you're actually just taking this whole list of things and doing all of them. And so that's kind of the list of things to do downfall of strategy. And then finally, there's fluff. And so fluff is, things like saying that you will be best in class or world class or something like that. Like that doesn't really mean anything, because you're not talking about strategy at that point. You're just adding adjectives and superlatives to the things that you're doing. So why is bad strategy bad? So you could say that, well, we're just going to move forward with the strategy because at least it's something. What that will do, though, and the knock-on effects to something like that is that, one, it doesn't really link the high level to the day-to-day action. So if you're doing things at the team level that are not actually addressing some type of bigger challenge, you have an organization that is being very scattered when it comes to its thinking. And it's not focusing everybody going in one direction. It will focus the team on the wrong things. And so, basically going after a strategic objective, which is not the best thing for the entire organization, is bad. And as I said, the other case of this is that it doesn't focus on anything. And so really anything goes. This is related to avoiding tough decisions. One of the key things about strategy is that it really is about making a choice between two good alternatives. And that choice should be based on the fact that you're trying to make that tough decision in a way that will give you an advantage within the marketplace. And then also it makes the wrong trade-offs. So that means that when you're making those types of tough decisions, you're actually prioritizing choices that are not in line with what the overall strategy should be. And in other cases, it means that you don't have to make trade-offs at all, which is false. You always have to make a trade-off, because there's no such thing as unlimited time, unlimited resources. You have to make choices to decide what you're going to focus on. One common thing I've heard is that for small teams that are just getting started, that there is no strategy that they're actually utilizing. And the reality is that you do have a strategy. It's just that it's in each person's head. And there's not necessarily any alignment between those different strategies. So even though you may say that you do not have a strategy, there still is a strategy that you're going after.
So we just had a question come in, Chris.
Great.
And this question is from Krish. And Krish is asking, do you have any examples of good strategy documents you've come across?
Yes, absolutely. I think like one of the strategy documents that I've come across, there's been some interesting ones that I've seen from like New York Times where they go into a lot of depth. I think the problem with a lot of strategy documents that I've seen is that they tend to be very large. And we're talking about tens of pages trying to describe what they're doing. I think the ideal strategy documents that I've seen have been less than a page long. And they really help focus the discussion around what is key and what can be remembered by the entire organization. So we'll get into this a little bit further on about a method that I've found to help have that discussion. But I tend to think like a page document is the right level of information. I mean, of course, you want to back that up with other content if you need it, but it really is about getting to that like half page to page summary of why that business exists. And if you can communicate it that way, I think that's most effective.
Cool. That's all the questions we have at the moment. Keep them coming in by posting to theproductmentor.com/live. And with that said, let's hand it back to Chris.
Great. Thank you. So, I think getting back to why Agile needs strategy, and I wanted to put, again, this concept of the North Star, that when it comes to Agile, people are moving very fast. They're iterating rapidly, but they're not always feeling necessarily that there is a endpoint that they're going after. And so, I think that's where really good strategy can be a key component to Agile, is being that North Star. And so we'll talk in a little bit about how those things are connected in the day-to-day. But that's the reason why I think strategy is needed in the Agile world. So there's this blog, Ribbon Farm, which I really love a lot. They have a lot of really great articles. In particular, this post about startup secrets and abductive reasoning by Joseph Kelly. Really, I think starts to talk to the core of what strategy is supposed to be doing. And in particular, it talks a lot about lean, but I think it's very appropriate for Agile as well. And so one of the things that he brings up is this concept of a secret, which comes from Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 book, which is chapter 8, I believe. And you can read this online if you don't want to read the whole book. But it really focuses on there's some type of secret that you as an organization have that puts you in an advantage to other people. And it's some type of secret way of thinking or some type of advantage that you know of about how you think the world works. And that's really what comes down to when we talk about like abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is really, it's different from deduction or induction, which is about taking a general rule and making it specific, or taking a specific rule and making it generic. Abductive reasoning is kind of like a leap to some idea based on everything that you know, but there's not necessarily a direct logical connection between those two things. And a lot of what people do when we talk about creative thought is really that type of abductive thinking. And so in particular, we start, for example, with a worldview, and that's kind of before this abduction arrow that's right there. And we collect a lot of information. Probably when people are pulling together a startup idea, they have some background that they then synthesize that information and then abduct to some type of secret that they think will give them an advantage, or is something special about what that organization or that project would be about. The way that that plugs into, in this particular case, Lean with the build, measure, learn loop, is that you take that secret and then you try some type of experiment to either validate or invalidate some part of that. You then take that insight and make another bet towards a secret that could have been modified, or it could be the same secret, and then do another iteration. And I think of Agile as just another, with this BML loop, basically your Agile loop is there. And so I think the thing here that is very interesting is that there's kind of this overall secret that you're constantly iterating on. It's probably not changing extensively unless you're invalidating parts of it while you're doing your learning. But you're taking bets one at a time on how you can either validate or invalidate that particular secret. So I think this is a very powerful concept. And I think, like, when we talk about how strategy works with an Agile environment, is this constant iteration and checking against what you believe. It's like it's a lot like hypothesis thinking as well, except the secret is very in particular about what makes your organization different.
We just had another question come in. So let's see. This one is from an anonymous individual, very mysterious. And they're asking, what's the best way to move an organization from bureaucratic Agile to networked Agile?
I think, well, one of the things is, and this is definitely it's a very interesting question because it's a tough one. Like, even just getting a team to become an Agile team is sometimes a hard thing to do. I've found actually a way to kind of trick people into thinking in an Agile way is to start having retros on some regular basis. Even if you're not working in some type of iterative format, having a retro really pushes people, especially one where you're including the people that are doing the work or the people that are impacted by the work. Starting to do that retro, say every 2 weeks or every month, everybody starts to talk about how the process should change over time together. And so I think using that concept at the team level, I think gets people moving towards this idea of iterative thought, right? The way you do that to be able to get to a Agile overall organization is getting managers and the executive team to start to think within the cadence of their work in a Agile way as well. So I would say, like, maybe one technique to do that is to start to have someone within that management group that's a good sponsor of Agile thinking, to start to look at the way that they take on things like hiring, culture, strategy in a way that through that retro mechanism starts to think in an iterative Agile way. So that would be one way I would think about it. Yeah.
Excellent. That's all the questions we have at the moment. But as always, go to theproductmentor.com/live and keep the questions coming in, and we'll keep passing them along. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. So great. So I think, this gets to the fact that especially the idea of this secret is that the world is a very complex place, right? And from that standpoint, when we talk about frameworks like Cynefin or complex adaptive systems, complexity theory, it's no longer as simple as understanding a cause and effect relationship between what you do in the industry and what then happens with your users, like selling a product. You actually have to experiment an awful lot to understand how that complex network works. And especially when you're talking about adding some type of software or service to an industry, it's not always as simple as making the offering available and then people buy it. You have to understand how you fit within that complex network. So strategy is very key. It's that secret is that theory about how that network works. And then you need to take these experiments on, which, we'll think about them as like bets, to then understand further whether that theory about the way the system works is correct or not. So how do we start to create a good strategy? And Richard Rummel has a lot of thoughts about this. I think it's a great starting point. He has a structure that he calls the strategy kernel, and it's broken down into 3 things. So one is a diagnosis, and this is really the nature of the challenge. So what is the main thing that this organization is existing to help solve? And then underneath that, the guiding policy is that approach to then overcome the obstacles or the challenge that's identified in the diagnosis. And then there's coherent actions. And that really comes to the point of like, what are the kind of, how do you coordinate within your organization so that you will be accomplishing this guiding policy? So a toy example of this would be a doctor. And so, a doctor, when they are actually working with a patient, there's a bunch of signs or symptoms that they then take together with the history, and the doctor makes some type of clinical diagnosis, either naming a disease or a pathology or something like that. And the guiding policy is really their recommendation for a therapeutic approach. So that would be, if you have this type of disease, this type of therapy works in general. And then the coherent actions are all of those different things that are within that therapeutic plan, essentially. And so that could be things like medication, it could be diet, it could be exercise, it could be surgery. So those are all things that now need to take place because of that particular hypothesis about the disease that the person has. And when it comes to very tricky diagnostic type of things, it could be that your first theory or your first way to address that challenge, which is the set of symptoms in the history, is wrong. And so you need to then adapt. The example that Rummel likes to give in his book is NVIDIA, which was, basically they're a graphics card manufacturer. Kind of in the 90s, they were doing not so great. They were being beaten by their competitor, 3DFX. And in particular, what they identified as the diagnosis was that they were moving too slow. And as a company, even though they were moving at Moore's law when it came to these types of cards, so it's like every 18 months, it was still too slow to actually beat the market because they had some pretty strong competitors. And in fact, like Intel was going to try to come in at that time. So their guiding policy was essentially, we need to be faster. And so what they then did is, because they were a very large company, these coherent actions tended to be a bit larger, but they were then broken down to further actions. But the really big ones were essentially, rather than having one team working for 18 months, they would have 3 teams that'd be working 6 months apart from each other. So even though internally the process would still take 18 months from end to end, they actually were able to create the appearance that they were working at 6-month cycles. They also invested an awful lot into simulation and emulation facilities because of the way that building drivers on top of hardware usually was the last step, but if they could parallelize it through those simulation and emulation software, that could cut time. And then, they started to gain more control over the way that driver development was done. They brought that in-house rather than being farmed out to a third party. And so, over the next decade, that theory that they had about just having to be faster, and the way that they decided their secret to solve that, which was have 3 teams working at 6-month offsets, made them the winner, basically. And so, 3DFX ended up going out of business. Intel entered the market, but didn't really do anything. And I think in 2007, Forbes named NVIDIA Company of the Year. So that worked out pretty well for them. And then, if we want to take a look at a more modern company like Uber, and again, Uber did not necessarily go through this process in writing down their strategy this way, but I want to use it as an example. And so, the way that Uber originally started was really, a couple guys in San Francisco couldn't get taxis to come to their, couldn't get taxis to come pick them up as quickly as they wanted to. And, I lived in San Francisco around that time, like 2008, I think it was. And it was pretty horrible. Like, you'd call for a taxi, it may or may not show up. And so their goal was really just to try to get a taxi to show up faster, right? And they built an app and they started to experiment. But I think as they started to learn, that was really the beginning of an identification of the challenge, right? And so the challenge in this particular case is that passengers within a metro are very frustrated or dissatisfied with the way that transportation markets would work. And so in that particular case, like there was lack of clarity, efficiency, options, accountability of those taxi cabs. And so, as they started to grow their business, they started to see that it wasn't just about an app that would then contact a taxi service or a black car limo service, but it was really about their guiding policy, or their secret in this particular case was that there needed to be a better marketplace, a two-sided marketplace of transportation within a local area. And so that's why they created the Uber as essentially a marketplace, because it's a two-sided transaction. And then the coherent actions that started to fall out of that is, for one, having an app that uses GPS to show locations, for example, or the way that they allow both drivers and passengers to rate each other to weed out bad actors within that marketplace, so that as it gets more liquid, or the liquidity goes up within that marketplace, you're keeping a high quality bar for those types of interactions. Things like cashless payments, et cetera, et cetera. And so those were all coherent actions that fit underneath this idea of just creating a better marketplace within that local area. So we start to talk now about how do we, I've done a certain number of these kernels just by writing them out. And I felt like it was something where I would do on my own after I had talked to, when we talk about philosophy as a product strategist, I'll work with the product owner or their stakeholders to try to gather as much information I can to get, basically a duplicate of the vision in my head, so that I can then make help them make decisions with our teams. And so one of the things that we would do to start off when we do a kickoff with a company is to do a business model canvas or a lean model canvas. And so those things are really great about breaking out a bunch of ideas. And so there wasn't a good one for strategy, though. This one is one that I've found, product strategy canvas. There's also there's a strategy canvas, which is by Blue Ocean. But they tend to fall into some of these traps that when we talk about bad strategy. So in particular, this idea of actually talking about a challenge number gets you into goal territory rather than trying to understand how you're addressing that problem. So what we created was something called the strategy kernel canvas. And this is really just meant to be a first step in the discussion. And it's a way so that you can have a shared understanding of the different components of a strategy. And so I'll take you through that right now. So this is the strategy kernel canvas. And at the end of this talk, there's a link to a Medium article that discusses how to do this. But the things that are really key here are, well, first of all, left to right is really from the past until the future. And in particular, you have history on the left-hand side, which, when you talk about these types of organizations, the context of how you got to this point is very important. The middle part, which is really the current strategy, is what is happening right now. What do we care about right now? And then there's the metrics for success and survival. So what's the bare minimum type of information we need to know about, or success that we need to see to continue to survive? And then what is that higher bar where we start to consider ourselves a success? And in the middle, when you look at it, it's from top to bottom. It goes from very high level to very low level. And so we have the diagnosis, which is, again, that nature of the challenge that you're trying to address. There's the guiding policy, which is that secret that you have, that you are now below that taking different bets to either validate or invalidate that particular guiding policy. And I think one other thing I add in here is a bet against. And in the case of something like Uber, a bet against in this case would be caring about local regulation and laws, right? They purposely do not fit within regulatory structures in the markets that they play in. And so they're betting against the fact that regulatory adoption actually matters. And then below that, you have all of your actions and processes that fall out of these bets. And so the way you should be thinking about this is that once you have this diagnosis and guiding policy, you start to then create bets that will help, again, validate or invalidate that. And then underneath that bet, there are things that you will do. So an example of this would be, in the case of Uber, in the diagnosis, we need to build a more transparent marketplace. That guiding, the diagnosis is that it's a bad marketplace right now in a local area. There's not enough accountability with the different actors, and basically passengers are unhappy and their needs are not being met. So the guiding policy is, how do we now create this more liquid marketplace between drivers and passengers. And then one of those bets would be when we, to make sure that we have a great marketplace, we need to make sure that we're removing bad actors from that system. And so we will have the ability for both drivers and passengers to rate each other. And then those actions are particular features that start to show up in the apps themselves. And so you can see that for the very bottom part of the action area, it's essentially you're creating a link from that action to the very top level. And anytime that you have a break in that particular chain, you should be worried. And so the way that we've tended to work through this, I think we've done say 2 workshops for about an hour or 2 each. The first one really trying to dive deep into how you figure out the diagnosis, the guiding policy, maybe start to touch on some bets. You then, in the second workshop, solidify it, write it up into something that is easily shareable. And then I think the way that this breaks up, I think, very neatly when it comes to what a management team or a management agile team should be doing and how it relates to the other agile teams is that the management team should be really setting the diagnosis and the guiding policy and then partially the bets. And then each agile team should be providing frontline information about customers to then create those bets and those actions or processes below that. And so I find that it's very effective, and it gives people a bit more meaning when they're able to own the pieces of the puzzle that they actually have the most direct impact on. And so that's why, the top half usually is done from a management perspective. The bottom half is done for each individual team. And I found that to be very effective.
So I have 2 questions that just came in. First one is from an anonymous individual. And that person is asking, what's the recommendation to integrate or get the support? Hold on a second. Let me try that one more time. What's the recommendation to integrate or get the support agile model from HR? Wait, hold on. Sorry. Someone had fun with the keyboard on this one. What's the recommendation to integrate or get the support agile model from HR? Do they play stakeholder role to ignite engagement working?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it matters how you're thinking about HR in this particular case. I think when you talk about how, say, a management agile team at the very top would be concerned with hiring or culture, they would work very closely with an HR agile team that is doing the actual hiring, right? Like they're the people that are probably doing a lot of the screening of different individuals, how they go about finding people, how they create that pool, and then how do they work with the individual agile teams to find the right people through interview processes. So again, I think HR would probably be another agile team in themselves, but there may be some type of executive, usually the CEO is the person who is most concerned with hiring practice within a particular organization, and so they should be very much involved in that. That's the way I'd put that.
And then the other question, I think it's just a brief one, is from Krish again. Krish is asking, is a bet equals a hypothesis? Question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think hypothesis and bet is probably the right analogy for that, because you have some, based on that guiding policy, which is your secret of how you plan on executing against that challenge, there's going to be a bunch of smaller hypotheses that you want to then test out. So I think hypothesis, bet, they can be interchangeable words in this particular case. Yeah, I think that's fair. So anything that you do with hypothesis thinking, so if you have an experiments dashboard, right, that's where you should be keeping your main bets. I tend to think, depending on the size of the organization, those bets can be either very large, right, or they can be very small. So if you're an early startup, those bets are probably your experiments dashboard. If you're a very large organization, those bets are probably basis for teams to exist. And then below that, there's, again, that chain down to day-to-day action. So I think when you look at this strategy canvas, this is really the first stage of it. You may, in a very large organization, actually have many layers that are below that. But that's the key point, is that you're trying to build something that's from very top level down to those day-to-day actions for an individual to understand.
Excellent. Keep the questions coming in at theproductmentor.com/live. Back to you, Chris.
Great. So now, how can we test the strategy? I have a couple kind of ways that I do this. One of them is the saying no exercise. And so in this particular case, when trying to figure out what you're betting against, the saying no exercise is really getting together and trying to create a list of everything that you will not be doing. And so we have a tool called .voter app at Philosophy, which is free to use for anybody, but it's basically an online ideation tool that also allows voting. So what we'll do is we'll have everybody go in for 2 minutes and privately create a list of everything that we should not be doing as an organization. And then we have everybody vote on it. And the things where there's least agreement are actually the points of contention that you need to discuss when it comes to the strategy. Another one is what I call the bizarro strategy exercise. So just like the biggest issue with fluff when it comes to good strategies is that people will say something like the worst class customer, so like best in class customer experience. There's very rare cases where worst class customer experience is actually acceptable. So taking the opposite of whatever you do should also be a valid strategy, because again, we're trying to go after key tough decisions that will then make your secret, right, or your kind of guiding policy be better than your other competitors, or do a better job of addressing that challenge. And if you can't say that your strategy in the opposite sense is also a good strategy, then you may not have a good strategy. And then I've collected a list here of kind of common weaknesses, and this is from McKinsey articles, HBR, a couple other things. But I like to go through these one by one as we're talking about a strategy and just say, you know, well, one, is there a linkage from the very top to the very bottom? Is there any bias that we can sense here that maybe at first blush we don't notice? So I think this is like a good list to be able to start to think about and take apart your strategy. I think
we got some more questions here. Let's see, starting with the first anonymous individual. By the way, I do encourage people who are posting anonymously to at least put their first name there. It's easier so we know who we're talking to. So the first anonymous individual says, what is that .voter app, and did I hear that right?
Yeah, so it's .voterapp.com, and it's basically, it's kind of like if you were to do private ideation on sticky Post-it notes. That's basically what it is. Here, let me. And I'll post a link to this later too. But you can see right here the .voter app. But essentially, it allows you to do private ideation with voting. So I can create a board like you know, TPG, and then people can automatically create cards. So you can share out this link and you can say like good idea 1, good idea 2. And you can turn on private ideation, for example. And then everybody gets a certain number of votes to vote on here. And so in this case, like there would be 3. And then I go in and vote a bunch of these things. And so you can do this with remote teams. We find it very helpful with, you know, in the room teams as well. So.
All right, and the next question is, and by the way, spaces are our friends, everyone. This one's a little tricky for me to read. This one, another anonymous individual. How do you move folks from functional, it's my job only, to so this, versus collaboration, agile team experimentation? Oh, and this is from Elizabeth, who is signing her questions.
Great. Yeah, I think, again, this tool of using the retro as the way to get people to start talking about what they need from a process. I think that's one of the really most important things, is that if people have ownership over the process that they're participating in, they're much more likely to make sure that it's a success. And then I think there's another thing. There's a great HBR article that talks about, I think it's from like 1994. So this idea that executives or managers can, in some cases, create learned helplessness by taking care of problems rather than having the individuals address them themselves. And so that's where you need to have the right environment from an executive standpoint or from a management standpoint to be able to address things in that way. So what that would mean is, you know, in some of our retros, there was one retro in particular where there was an issue that design and engineering were not talking enough, and we're not co-creating on some of the items that they should be. And so one way to deal with that could be that I actually jump in the middle of it and organize a meeting to get engineering and design to talk to each other, and I facilitate that conversation. But the right way to actually handle that is that I tell them it's their job to fix this, right? And then they go and fix it. And if it doesn't get fixed in the next retro, it's very clear that the people that should be attending to this issue are not attending to it. And so I think that's the other environmental thing, is that I think whenever you start to get into a management level, you want to try to take over and make your team's lives easier, but it may be hurting them in the long term.
Excellent. That's just another question that came in. It's not a question, it's just a statement, and I appreciate it. They will use more spaces in the future. All right.
Great. Okay, so I'll get back in.
Yeah, so back to you, Chris.
Great. So the only thing I would just say is, like, so now you've written down this strategy into this canvas. Maybe you've translated it into a document. You've tested it, and now you're done. No, you're not. Actually, you need to continue to iterate on this, and you want to continue to have that discussion. And so this goes to, how do product people now start to link this strategy to their day-to-day? And there's a few behaviors that I think are really powerful. So one, Brandon Shu wrote this blog post about the heuristics of being a product director, and I think it's applicable to product people in general. And the first thing is that the product person should know the strategy, and they should know it so well that they will be a broken record with the rest of the team. They should be repeating it every day. They should be bringing it up in conversations. They should be using it as justification for decisions. And especially when you talk about how product people, their focus is about prioritization, understanding that prioritization or dealing with the ambiguity of the things that are going on within the product should be through the lens of the strategy. The next thing is that when you talk about planning, so if you do, say, a planning meeting, if you're doing Agile, you're doing ideally a planning meeting at the beginning of a sprint, you should be reviewing the strategy. So I think this is related to that broken record, but I think it's a very applicable thing to do, is that if you have this written down in any format, whether it's a Canvas or a page document, you should just read it again. And that helps frame, especially when you're talking about that this sprint, for example, would be going after this particular bet. Right, that I think is a very powerful thing. The next thing is when we talk about road mapping, being focused, and this is a great article based on kind of like, road mapping is one of those touchy subjects for me, because I tend to be an extremist when it comes to things like backlogs and whether there is value in roadmaps. I think the value of a roadmap is actually to be problem focused, and like, what problems are we going after? And that's very much related to the bets that you're working on. And so I think when you talk about how you do road mapping, being road mapping on top of the bets that you're doing, I think is really that key aspect that you can take and do immediately. The next thing is how we do prioritization. So when we talk about, at Philosophy, we do very early stage type of stuff. So usually there's no product yet, and we don't know an awful lot. So the way that we start to prioritize is we look at the key or the crux aspects of our secrets and bets and work on those first. And so in this particular case, Alia, who's a person I work with at Philosophy, she wrote this great article about how they do journey mapping and feature selection. And so in this particular case, the vertical axis is importance or perceived importance to a particular persona. And then the horizontal axis is known to unknown, in the sense, have we built this before? Do we know someone that's built this before? Or has no one ever built this before? And that also gets to, like, when we talk about design of interaction or UX, like, do we know how this type of thing works? Like, is there, and getting into like Cynefin, is this a simple domain problem like login, where login has kind of been solved? If you do login a different way, you're probably going to just have to retrain people, and it's not going to give you much benefit. Or is this more of an unknown where other people haven't really figured this out yet, and it's more in the complex territory? And so how do you now start to look at those really key things about your bets and secrets, and then prioritize the things that are unknown rather than the things that are known? And then, maybe the most important thing that a product person should be doing is being the watchdog for when there is drift or divergence from the strategy. So because that product person is usually at the Agile team level, they should be able to notice when their Agile team is working on things that are not in some way directly linked through that chain up to the overall strategy. And they should use this as an opportunity to talk about the strategy with management and with their team. And in some cases, it means the team is working on the wrong things, but it could also be that the team has realized something about the market that should change the guiding policy or even the diagnosis in the worst case.
So a new question just came in from Sue.
Yep.
Sue says, great explanation about strategy and how it differs from vision. And then it goes on to say, shouldn't a clearly defined and understood vision come before executing strategies?
Yeah, I think the problem with vision is that you're basically coming up with an idea of how the world will be in some future state, like 5 to 10 years out. And that's very hard to get right. Like people that are forecasters that work for like the CIA, there's a great book about super forecasting. You know, the idea of forecasting in general, I think, is very difficult to do right. And the people that tend to do it right look at overall themes rather than particular outcomes, because you don't know, you know, what particular people are going to do, because it's just unknown what someone in 5 years from now is going to be doing. So I'd say like vision is great. I think it's a great way to think about like what the potential end state of these technologies could be, but it's really fiction, right? Like that's the biggest problem with vision, is that it's a fictional explanation of the way the world could be in some future. Whereas the strategy is really like, how are you making decisions right now? That's really what strategy is about.
Excellent. Keep the questions coming in at theproductmentor.com/live as we're winding down this talk, and back to you, Chris.
Great, thank you. So what is great strategy? I think there's a couple of things that you'll notice when you do actually have a great strategy. And you know, those types of things are, people are making the right decisions at a very basic, like day-to-day level that are in line with the strategy without having that type of check-in with management. That's something that should just, once everybody has this archetype or voice in the back of their head of what the organization's strategy is, they can start to view the world in all the decisions that they make for that product with that strategic lens. And then, you know, anytime that there are issues that cause divergence from the day-to-day to the overall, it's something that is immediately talked about. And it's not a bad thing. It's more about like being able to make these types of right decisions. You need to have that open discussion around strategy all the time. So just remember, you know, I believe that strategy is very key to an Agile group success, and I hope I've made that case. And strategy isn't something you create, but there are tools that you can use to create a strategy in a way that is more easily communicated. But you're still going to iterate on it. You're still moving it. You're still checking in on it, making sure it's working, taking bets on that strategy over and over and over again as you try to find success. And then you should just start to have that conversation about strategy, even if it is not a perfect strategy, it's a strategy. And it's something you can start a line around. And you want to write that down, and you want to make it part of your process every day. And I would say like the biggest thing about strategy that is most interesting is that when you have this type of tight alignment around strategy, every team within the group can have way more autonomy than they did before. And so I think that's a very empowering thing. So thank you. And here's a link to be able to find the Medium blog post that talks about the strategy kernel canvas, and links to all the resources from this talk. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris, who is also Senior Product Strategist at Philosophy, for today's discussion on strategy in an agile environment. And as always, the presentation will be posted on our SlideShare channel. And a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and everyone else who joined us today in the Product Mentor. And don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor, just like today's speaker, Chris, to product people of all sorts all around the world, visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. We're in over 20 different countries. And if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free-for-all job board at theproductjobs.com. With all that said, I'll see you guys all next time. Bye.
Thank you.